There are faces that the camera never forgets. Faces carved not by makeup or fame, but by the fire of something ancient: pain, pride, and silence. Claudia Cardinale was one of those faces. Her eyes, dark as the Mediterranean before a storm, could tell entire stories without a word. In the golden age of cinema, when beauty was currency and desire the language of power, she stood as both muse and mystery. For men, she was a dream. For women, a question. How could someone so luminous carry so much sorrow behind her smile? In the 1,960 seconds, when the world fell at her feet after 8.5 and The Leopard, Claudia became the very embodiment of European glamour. But behind the lights, there was a different script, one she never auditioned for. Before she learned to pose for cameras, she had learned to hide. Before she learned to act, she had learned to survive. The girl who had once run through the sunlit alleys of Tunis would be forced to keep a secret so heavy it would shape every role she ever played. Hollywood came for her, as it came for everyone beautiful and foreign. She could have been the next Sophia Loren, the next international goddess of the screen, but she refused to bend her identity for fame. She spoke in her own accent, lived by her own code, and carried the shadow of a truth she would not reveal for decades: that her son was not her brother, as the world was told. He was the child of a wound she never chose. Every photograph of her seemed to carry that duality, grace and defiance. There was something untouchable about her, as if she were always half in sunlight, half in exile. In interviews, she laughed softly, her voice a low melody, but her eyes told another story, one of exile, of resilience, of a woman who refused to let shame define her. In an industry built on illusions, Claudia Cardinale became a symbol of authenticity. Her tragedy was not that she fell, it was that she had to rise, again and again, while pretending she was never broken. The camera adored her, but it never truly saw her. It captured her face, not her truth. And maybe that's why, after decades of fame, she quietly walked away, not in bitterness, but in peace. She once said, "Cinema gave me everything, except myself." This is the story of a woman who lived between the frames, between myth and memory, between love and silence. The woman who became a legend not because she chased the light, but because she dared to step out of it. Before the name Claudia Cardinale echoed across the world, there was only a girl, quiet, curious, and sunlit, growing up in the mixed and fragrant air of Tunis. The year was 1938. The world was on the edge of war, but in La Goulette, the harbor neighborhood where Claudia was born, the sea seemed eternal, and so did childhood. Her parents, Sicilian immigrants, carried the nostalgia of their island in their bones. Her father, Francesco, a stern but gentle man who worked as a railway engineer, and her mother, Yolanda, a devout woman of strong will and sharp eyes. In their modest home, voices intertwined Italian, French, Arabic, as if every language was a fragment of belonging. For young Claudia, that mixture would become both a gift and a curse. She would always belong to many places, and to none completely. Her early life was simple, yet deeply sensory. She remembered the salt on her lips from the wind that swept through the streets, the sound of merchants calling in Arabic, the smell of fish and coffee in the mornings. But she also remembered silence. From an early age, Claudia preferred to listen. She was known among neighbors as La Ragazza Silenziosa, the quiet girl. Her silence was not shyness, but a kind of self-protection. She watched everything, absorbing people's gestures, faces, and moods, the instincts that would later make her such an extraordinary actress. In the small Italian community of Tunis, tradition ruled. Women were expected to marry young, raise children, and keep their heads bowed. Claudia's mother insisted on discipline and discretion. Her father, though kind, was distant, a man from another era, where affection was a weakness and silence a virtue. In that atmosphere, Claudia grew up between love and constraint, between light and shadow. She attended a French-language school run by Catholic nuns. Her teachers admired her intelligence, but noted her quietness. "Claudia," one wrote in her report, "possesses a soul of mystery." At that time, she dreamed not of acting, but of teaching. Cinema was something distant, flickering black and white images that played in small theaters on weekends. She would later say that she never imagined being part of that world, because people like her, girls from immigrant families, were not meant to be seen. But fate, as it so often does, was already writing a script she could not read. When Claudia turned 17, a tragedy struck that would shape the rest of her life. It was during a summer festival. Music, lights, and laughter filled the Tunisian air. Amid that chaos, she was assaulted and raped. The event shattered her innocence and left her pregnant. For a young Catholic girl in the 1952 in a conservative family, it was an unthinkable disgrace. Shame in that era was a weapon sharper than any blade, and for her family, silence became survival. Her mother took charge, her father's eyes turned to stone, and Claudia, terrified and numb, was forced into secrecy. She carried the child in silence. In the quiet hours of the night, she would sit by the window, watching the sea, wondering if life would ever forgive her. When she gave birth to her son, Patrick, she was told that he would have to be introduced as her brother. It was the only way, they said, to protect the family's honor and the child's future. And so, the secret began a lie born of love and pain, one that would follow her through every stage of her life. In later interviews, Claudia never spoke of the assault directly. She always called it "what happened." But those who worked with her often said they could feel something in her eyes, a deep well of sorrow hidden behind strength. That quiet pain became her signature on screen. The woman who smiled without joy, who loved without illusions, who could break without making a sound. Fate intervened again in the most unexpected way. One afternoon, a film director visiting her school noticed her unusual beauty and suggested she enter a beauty contest. Claudia refused, embarrassed by the attention. She had no interest in glamour, and she didn't believe she was beautiful. But a teacher, seeing something extraordinary in her, entered her name anyway. The contest, "The Most Beautiful Italian Girl in Tunisia," changed everything. Claudia arrived reluctantly, without makeup, without confidence. Yet, when she stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent. She didn't pose or preen. She simply stood there, looking past the judges with calm defiance, her hair loose in the sea breeze. That was the moment the world began to see what she had hidden all along: the quiet power of someone who had already endured. She won, and the prize was a trip to Venice, her first journey outside Tunisia. At the Venice Film Festival, surrounded by glittering celebrities and the hum of cameras, she felt like an intruder. She barely spoke, uncomfortable in her own skin, but the Italian producers who saw her were fascinated. They had never seen someone so radiant and so unreadable at once. One of them, the renowned producer Franco Cristaldi, approached her family and offered to bring her to Rome to study acting. It sounded absurd. She had never acted, never dreamed of fame, but her mother, perhaps sensing destiny, agreed. Claudia left Tunis with a suitcase and a secret. Her son remained behind, cared for by relatives. On the ship to Italy, she stood on deck at night, watching the sea fade into darkness, feeling both free and exiled. She was leaving her past, but it clung to her like salt on her skin. In Rome, she entered the Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia, Italy's most prestigious film school. Her accent set her apart. She spoke Italian with a strange French melody, her voice low and smoky. Teachers tried to correct it, but she refused. "If I change my voice," she said, "I change myself." That decision would later make her unforgettable. Her first days were lonely. She lived in a small apartment, wrote letters home, and cried quietly at night. She was still just a teenager, a girl carrying an invisible weight in a city of strangers. But something in her began to awaken. The camera, which had once frightened her, now fascinated her. It didn't judge, it listened. In front of it, she could be anyone, anywhere, even herself. And so, from the silence of Tunis emerged the woman who would soon become the voice of Italian cinema. She didn't rise through ambition, she rose through necessity. Acting wasn't a dream, it was survival. Every role she would later play carried traces of that girl who learned to hide and endure. The girl who had lived 2 lives before turning 20. Claudia Cardinale's story did not begin with fame. It began with silence, with a wound buried under grace, with a mother who became a sister, and with a voice the world would one day recognize not for its sound, but for its truth. When Claudia Cardinale arrived in Rome, she stepped into a city vibrating with dreams. Cinecittà was the beating heart of post-war Italy, a world of flickering spotlights, cigarette smoke, and the hum of cameras capturing a country rediscovering itself through beauty and chaos. Claudia was not dazzled. She watched. She learned. She moved like someone who already understood that fame could burn as much as it could illuminate. Her accent, her silence, her refusal to play the coquettish star made her stand out in an industry where every woman was expected to smile on command. At first, directors didn't know what to do with her. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the loud, deliberate way that Hollywood adored. There was something raw about her, something untamed. Her voice, low, husky, distinctly Tunisian, was unlike the polished tones of other actresses. Producers tried to convince her to let someone dub her lines, to hide the traces of her foreignness. She refused. That decision would define her. "If I lose my voice," she once said, "I lose myself." Her first notable break came in 1958 with Goha, a Tunisian-Italian film where she starred opposite Omar Sharif. It was a small production, but it marked her debut and drew the attention of Italian critics. Soon after, she was cast in Rocco and His Brothers by Luchino Visconti, a film that would cement her as a face of the new Italian realism. On screen, she embodied contradictions: innocence and defiance, fragility and fire. Visconti called her a wild creature with the soul of a saint. But the turning point came in 1963, when Federico Fellini cast her in 8½. The film, a fever dream of cinema and self-reflection, became a masterpiece, and Claudia's presence within it was unforgettable. She played not just a woman, but an idea, the unattainable muse, the embodiment of purity in the midst of artistic chaos. Her quiet power and natural radiance turned her into a cinematic myth. The world finally saw her, though it never truly knew her. Hollywood, as always, wanted to claim what it could not create. Offers poured in. Scripts, contracts, invitations to Los Angeles. Claudia hesitated. She had built her identity in Europe, surrounded by filmmakers who valued complexity over perfection. Yet, curiosity, and perhaps a desire to test her strength, drew her westward. She appeared alongside legends like John Wayne in The Magnificent Showman and Henry Fonda in Once Upon a Time in the West. In each film, her presence transformed the frame. She didn't need grand speeches. One glance was enough to command attention. However, fame came with a cost. The press obsessed over her beauty, her body, her mysterious personal life. No one knew about her son. Interviews circled around the question of her origins, her accent, her supposed aloofness. "They thought I was distant," she said years later. "But I was only protecting myself." Beneath the lights, she was still the girl from Tunis, cautious, wounded, guarding her truth like a fragile relic. In Europe, she became the symbol of an era. Her collaborations with Visconti, Fellini, and Sergio Leone made her one of the most recognizable faces in international cinema. She was not just an actress, she was an atmosphere. Every film she touched carried the weight of her history, even when unspoken. Directors admired her ability to express deep emotion with restraint, to suggest pain without ever displaying it. She was cinematic poetry, the kind written in glances and pauses rather than words. Behind the scenes, she remained fiercely independent. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Claudia resisted the machinery of publicity. She refused to be molded into Hollywood's fantasy of the exotic beauty. She managed her own contracts, negotiated her roles, and demanded creative respect. In an industry dominated by men, she quietly became one of the few women who controlled her own career. "I wanted to choose," she said, "not to be chosen." Despite her growing fame, Claudia's life was still built around concealment. Her son, Patrick, lived with her, but under the guise of being her younger brother. Every TMA journalists visited, she rehearsed the same story. It was a performance far more difficult than any role she ever played. She smiled through the ache of secrecy, convincing the world that her life was glamorous and uncomplicated. But in private, she was haunted by the double life she was forced to maintain. In the mid-1960s, Claudia reached the height of her stardom. She became an icon not just of cinema, but of freedom, a woman who represented the sensual, intellectual, and political awakening of Europe. Feminists admired her for refusing to conform to Hollywood's image of submissive femininity. She was outspoken about her views on equality, even when it risked her career. "I never wanted to be a doll," she declared. "I wanted to be a woman who decides." Yet, amid the applause and red carpets, she often confessed to feeling lonely. Fame, she said, was a beautiful prison. The more adored she became, the more invisible she felt. Directors saw her as a muse, men saw her as a fantasy, but few saw the person, the mother, the survivor, the woman who still carried the memory of a 17-year-old girl who had lost her voice in Tunis. Acting became her therapy, her rebellion, and her confession all at once. By the end of the decade, Claudia had become a bridge between worlds, the last breath of classical European cinema and the dawn of a new, more fragmented Hollywood. She could have stayed in America, married fame forever. Instead, she chose something radical: distance. She began turning down major roles, seeking instead projects that spoke to her soul. It was not ambition that guided her anymore, but dignity. The young woman who had once been forced to silence herself was now shaping her own narrative, one choice at a TMA. Every film she made carried whispers of that defiance, a quiet revolution wrapped in grace. By the early 1972s, Claudia Cardinale stood at the summit of international cinema. Her face was everywhere on posters, magazine covers, and in the dreams of filmmakers who saw in her a timeless mystery they could never quite capture. She had conquered Europe, crossed into Hollywood, and defied every expectation of what a woman in film was supposed to be. Yet, even as the world adored her, Claudia herself began to sense the cost of becoming an icon. She was no longer a person. She was a projection, a collection of gazes, desires, and myths that had little to do with the woman inside. In public, she seemed unshakable. On set, she carried herself with a calm authority that earned her the respect of even the most difficult directors. "She doesn't act," Sergio Leone once said. "She simply is." And yet, the more commanding she became on screen, the more she withdrew in private life. Fame had given her everything: wealth, recognition, admiration, but it had also stolen her ability to live freely. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word twisted. Her collaboration with Leone in Once Upon a TMA in the West immortalized her as Jill McBain, the widow caught in a web of revenge and redemption. The film was an opera of dust and destiny, and Claudia was its tragic aria, beautiful, weary, indomitable. For many, it was her defining role, the moment she transcended beauty to become symbol. But for Claudia, it was also the beginning of her disillusionment. She began to see the machinery of stardom for what it was, a theater of consumption, where even pain could be sold if framed correctly. Hollywood had long tried to tame her. Producers wanted her to soften her accent, lose her weight, change her name. She refused all of it. "If they want me," she told an interviewer, "they must take me as I am, voice, scars, and all." But defiance came at a price. Offers began to slow, replaced by roles that reduced her to decoration. She saw herself being written into the background of male stories, her complexity flattened into cliché. For a woman who had built her identity on integrity, this was unbearable. Meanwhile, her personal life grew increasingly complicated. She had fallen in love with Franco Cristaldi, a powerful Italian producer who had discovered her early in her career. Their relationship was both professional and deeply personal, marked by devotion and control. Cristaldi managed every detail of her image, her contracts, her interviews, even the narrative surrounding her private life. To the outside world, he was her mentor. In truth, he was also her keeper. Under his guidance, the lie about her brother continued. Her son, Patrick, still called her Claudia in public. The secrecy had once been protection, but now it had become a cage. At award ceremonies, Claudia smiled gracefully beside Cristaldi, her hand on his arm, her voice soft and measured. But behind closed doors, she longed for truth to live without hiding. "I had two lives," she would later say, "one in the light and one in the dark. And sometimes I didn't know which one was real." Despite the emotional turmoil, her artistry deepened. She began taking on more introspective roles, exploring characters torn between strength and vulnerability. Films like The Girl with a Suitcase and Fitzcarraldo revealed a woman who no longer needed glamour to be magnetic. Her power came from authenticity. She was not playing the myth anymore. She was dissecting it. In interviews from this period, her tone changed. Gone was the timid girl who avoided difficult questions. Now she spoke openly about sexism in the industry, about the loneliness of fame, about the hypocrisy of beauty. "Men fall in love with the idea of me," she said, "but they never stay for the woman." That statement, quiet but devastating, became her unintentional manifesto. Her decision to remain in Europe rather than fully move to Hollywood baffled many. But Claudia knew that staying meant freedom, or at least fragments of it. She worked with visionary directors like Werner Herzog and Luigi Comencini, refusing to settle into the comfortable nostalgia of her past. Each new role was an act of rebellion against the industry's desire to turn her into an artifact. But fame has its way of eroding even the strongest foundations. The press, hungry for scandal, began to speculate about her private life. The son, the lover, the secrets. Claudia maintained her composure, but the weight of silence grew heavier each year. She found solace in motherhood, even if it remained hidden behind closed doors. "My son was my real life," she later confessed. "Everything else was performance." By the late 1972, Claudia's image began to shift. She was no longer the youthful goddess of the screen, but a woman of depth, grace, and quiet power. She aged on her own terms. No surgery, no reinvention, no desperate grasp at youth. In a culture terrified of Time, she embraced it. "Wrinkles are not ugly," she said. "They are the map of your life." That statement, simple yet profound, became her declaration of independence from the illusions that had once trapped her. She continued to act, but less frequently. The roles she chose were personal, reflective, often written by female directors or exploring themes of memory and loss. The audience that had once desired her now began to respect her. She was no longer an object. She was a presence, a reminder of a bygone era when cinema still belonged to the soul. Yet, even as she found peace in her craft, her personal reckoning loomed. The secret she had carried for decades, the existence of her son, could no longer remain buried. When she finally revealed the truth publicly, the world responded not with scandal but with admiration. What had once been seen as shame became a symbol of her strength. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice calm but firm, "to protect Chaim, to protect myself, and now I have nothing to hide." That confession, made in her later years, closed a circle that had begun in fear and ended in liberation. Claudia Cardinale, the girl who was once silenced by circumstance, had spoken at last, not through her films, but through her truth. Her reign at the top had lasted decades, but her true triumph was never in fame. It was in surviving it intact, honest, unbroken. She had turned her pain into poetry, her silence into strength, and her exile into art. Every rise in Hollywood, or in the golden world of European cinema, carries a shadow. For Claudia Cardinale, that shadow arrived quietly, not as scandal or ruin, but as a slow erosion of the self. The world still adored her, still called her name, still expected the same radiant woman who had once lit up the screen in 8½. But something had changed inside her. The camera that once felt like a confidant now felt like an intruder. The applause that once warmed her now echoed with emptiness. Fame, she realized, was not a crown. It was a mirror that never stopped reflecting, even when you no longer recognized the face it showed. The relationship with Franco Cristaldi, once her foundation, had become her prison. For years, he had managed her career with precision and care, but behind the curtain of professionalism was control. He dictated her public image, filtered her interviews, and made decisions in her name. Claudia, loyal and grateful to the man who had believed in her talent, stayed until she no longer could. The burden of pretense, of maintaining the facade of a perfect life, grew unbearable. What had begun as mentorship had turned into manipulation. She once said quietly, "I was free on screen, but never in my own life." The breaking point came in the early 1980 seconds. Claudia decided to end her long relationship with Cristaldi, reclaiming not only her independence, but also her identity. It was an act of defiance, and it came at a high cost. The Italian film industry, still patriarchal and unforgiving, turned cold. Projects disappeared. Offers slowed. She was no longer the untouchable muse. She was the woman who had dared to step outside the script written for her. But for the first time, Claudia felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. "I lost a manager," she said, "but I found my voice." In the aftermath, her private world seemed to collapse and rebuild itself at once. Her son Patrick, now grown, was finally acknowledged publicly as her child. The confession was both liberating and terrifying. For decades, she had lived with the fear of exposure. Now that it was over, she didn't know what to do with the silence it left behind. When journalists asked why she had hidden it for so long, she answered simply, "Because they would have destroyed us." Her fame had long been a mask, one that protected her from the world, but also from herself. Without it, she began to confront the pain she had buried for decades. The trauma of her assault, the years of secrecy, the quiet loneliness of being adored but never known. She had spent her life performing strength, and now, for the first time, she allowed herself to be fragile. "There were nights," she admitted in an interview, "when I would wake up and feel nothing, no joy, no sadness, just emptiness. That was worse than pain." During this period, Claudia withdrew from the limelight. She moved to Paris, where anonymity offered her a strange kind of sanctuary. She worked occasionally, choosing projects that resonated with her soul rather than her fame. Her performances became more internal, less about beauty, more about truth. In Claretta and Fitzcarraldo, she embodied women trapped by circumstance, but unbroken by it reflections of herself. Her absence from Hollywood was not a fall, but a quiet revolt. The industry that had once worshipped her could not understand why she walked away at her peak. To Claudia, the answer was simple. Because I no longer wanted to be consumed. The glare of fame had blinded her long enough. In solitude, she rediscovered what had first drawn her to cinema. Not the glamour, but the human stories hidden behind it. But even freedom has its ghosts. The 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds brought a new generation of stars, and the press began to refer to her as a relic of the past. The same media that once exalted her now wrote elegies for her career. Claudia refused to engage. She did not chase nostalgia, nor did she beg for relevance. "I am not a memory," she once said. "I am still alive, and that is enough." Privately, she struggled with the same insecurities that haunt every legend who outlives their myth. Aging in an industry obsessed with youth felt like slow exile, yet she refused to erase May from her face. When asked if she feared getting older, she smiled and said, "No, I fear not, having lived." It was a statement of defiance and acceptance. Her emotional collapse was never dramatic, never tabloid-worthy. It was quiet, like everything else about her. She experienced bouts of depression, insomnia, moments of deep introspection, but she also began writing, reflecting on her life with a clarity that came only from surviving it. Her memoir, Moi Claudia, Toy Claudia, published in 1995, was not a tale of tragedy, but of endurance. In its pages, she confronted the darkest moments of her life, the assault, the silence, the loss of identity with dignity and honesty. Readers were moved not by her suffering, but by her refusal to let it define her. Her collapse was, paradoxically, her rebirth. By embracing her wounds, she transformed them into wisdom. The woman who had once been photographed as an object of desire now became a voice for women's strength. She began advocating for women's rights, speaking openly about violence, discrimination, and the hypocrisy of the entertainment industry. "We are not porcelain dolls," she declared at a conference in Rome. "We are the clay from which civilization is built." As the years passed, Claudia became more than a movie star. She became a living testament to survival. Not the glamorous kind, but the quiet, steady kind that endures when applause fades. Her fame had collapsed, yes, but out of its ashes rose something purer: authenticity. When asked later in life what she regretted most, Claudia paused for a long TMA. Then she said, "That I never told the truth sooner, but maybe I couldn't have. I had to live through it first." It was an answer that carried the weight of an entire life, one lived in beauty, pain, silence, and resilience. By the TMA, the world finally understood her. Claudia Cardinale had already made peace with herself. She no longer needed validation. Her life, once dictated by others, now belonged entirely to her. When the lights of fame dimmed and the noise of applause faded, Claudia Cardinale entered the most profound chapter of her life, not as an actress, but as a survivor turned sage. The decades that followed were not about reclaiming the past, but about redefining what it meant to exist beyond it. Fame had once been her armor, her disguise, her punishment. Now, stripped of all illusions, she found herself standing in the rarest kind of peace, the quiet dignity of a woman who had faced everything and lost nothing essential. The consequences of her choices were both external and deeply personal. Professionally, her career slowed, the roles fewer, the scripts smaller. But each appearance carried the weight of a legend who no longer needed to prove anything. Directors approached her not to chase youth, but to capture depth. They knew that in Claudia's eyes lived entire histories not just of characters, but of cinema itself. When she appeared in films like And Now, Ladies and Gentlemen, or Princess Marie, it was not nostalgia the audience felt, but reverence. Her every gesture spoke of time, survival, and grace. Yet, what defined this final era of her life was not art, but activism. In the 1,990 seconds, Claudia began to use her voice, the same voice she had once been told to hide, to speak for those who had none. She became a United Nations Goodwill Ambassador, focusing on the rights of women and children, particularly victims of violence. It was an extraordinary transformation. The girl who had once lived in silence, now standing before world leaders, condemning the same kind of violence that had once scarred her. "I was silent for too long," she said in Geneva, "and silence helps only the oppressor." Her activism was not a performance. There were no rehearsed lines, no perfect lighting, just raw truth delivered with the authority of lived pain. She traveled to war zones, refugee camps, and schools in impoverished regions, her presence both symbolic and deeply human. She hugged children, listened to mothers, and never once placed herself above them. "They look at me as an actress," she told a journalist, "but I look at them as reminders of who I could have been if I had not been given a second chance." This compassion, born from suffering, became her new legacy. For Claudia, art had always been about empathy, the ability to feel the weight of another's soul. Now, her empathy had stepped off the screen and into reality. She spoke about trauma not as tragedy, but as testimony. "You cannot erase pain," she said, "but you can give it meaning." It was this philosophy that made her an icon, not only of cinema, but of resilience. Her later interviews revealed a woman at peace with time. She refused to chase youth, fame, or perfection. When journalists tried to provoke nostalgia, asking if she missed her golden years, she smiled gently and replied, "No, because they are not gone. They live in the films, and I live here, in the present." She was, in many ways, freer at 70 than she had ever been at 20. Her home in Paris became a sanctuary filled with memories, photographs of sets, letters from directors, drawings from fans, but more than anything, it was filled with silence. Not the silence of repression, but of serenity. She read voraciously, painted, and spent time with her son, who was now not just her child, but her closest friend. Their bond, once hidden in shame, had become a symbol of forgiveness and strength. "We built our truth together," she said, "and that is the most beautiful thing I have done in my life." When younger actresses came to visit her, seeking advice, she always told them the same thing: never let them define you. They will try with their words, their cameras, their love, but you must stay yours. To them, she was more than a legend. She was a mentor, a reminder that survival was its own kind of art. Culturally, Claudia's legacy extended far beyond her filmography. She came to represent a generation of women who refused to be reduced. Women who had endured the objectification of an era yet emerged as the authors of their own narratives. In an industry built on illusion, she stood as proof that truth was the most enduring beauty. Critics began to revisit her films with new eyes, recognizing the subtle power in her performances, the restraint, the pain beneath the poise, the humanity behind the glamour. In 2011, she received the Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement at the Venice Film Festival, a poetic return to the city where her journey to stardom had first begun. As she stood on stage, her hair silver and her voice steady, the audience rose in thunderous applause. She did not cry. She simply smiled and said, "It took me a lifetime to arrive here as myself." The words hung in the air, simple, unadorned, and perfect. Even in her later years, she continued to act occasionally, but always on her terms. She no longer played heroines. She played witnesses to history, to Time, to life itself. Her performances in these roles were hauntingly authentic, as though she had stopped acting altogether. It was as if the woman and the character had finally become one. By the Time she reached her 80s, Claudia Cardinale had transcended fame. She was no longer the woman of the 1,960 seconds posters. She was the conscience of an era. Her image, once sold as beauty, now represented endurance. Her story, once whispered as scandal, was now told as strength. The industry that once tried to silence her now celebrated her voice. When asked what she wanted to be remembered for, Claudia paused before answering. "Not for being beautiful," she said. "Not even for being an actress. I want to be remembered as someone who never stopped being human." It was the perfect epitaph for a life that had defied simplicity. In the end, her greatest legacy was not a film or an award, but a lesson that behind every image lies a soul, behind every silence a story. Claudia Cardinale had lived both the fairy tale and the nightmare, and she had emerged not bitter, but luminous. She had walked through fire and come out still carrying light. In the twilight of her life, Claudia Cardinale became something rarer than a star. She became a myth made human. The kind of figure that Time does not erase, but rather softens, like marble, polished by decades of admiration and sorrow. When she appeared in public, people did not see merely an actress. They saw history walking a living fragment of cinema's golden age, wrapped in poise and memory. And yet, even then, she resisted being treated as a relic. "I am not nostalgia," she once said. "I am what remains when nostalgia fades." Her face, lined by Time, had lost none of its radiance. The world had changed around her. New stars rose and fell. Film turned to pixels, stories to noise, but Claudia endured, like a still flame in an age of flickering lights. She no longer belonged to the cinema of glamour. She belonged to the cinema of truth. The irony was beautiful. The woman once told to stay silent had become the last honest voice of an industry that had lost its soul. Claudia's later years were marked by reflection rather than retreat. She spoke at film festivals and universities, not to celebrate fame, but to dissect it, to warn young artists of its cost. "Fame is like perfume," she told an audience in Paris. "Beautiful, intoxicating, but if you drink it, it poisons you." The crowd laughed softly, but her eyes did not. There was no bitterness in her tone, only understanding. Few could speak of fame's loneliness with such calm. Fewer still could transform that loneliness into wisdom. Her life story began to be studied not just as biography, but as metaphor. Film historians wrote essays about her silence as a form of rebellion. How her restrained performances defied the male gaze. How her refusal to conform became political. Feminist scholars hailed her as a pioneer of authenticity in an era built on illusion. They saw in her a quiet revolution, not shouted, but lived. And yet, there remained questions not of scandal, but of mystery. Who was Claudia Cardinale when the cameras stopped? Was she ever truly free of the secret that shaped her youth? Did she ever forgive the world that demanded her silence? She never answered directly. When asked about forgiveness, she said only, "Forgiveness is not forgetting, it is continuing." It was a typically Claudia response, poetic, elliptical, true. Her relationship with her son Patrick evolved into something sacred. They became inseparable, traveling together, sharing quiet mornings in Paris cafes. The boy who once had to call her sister now proudly introduced her as "my mother, the strongest woman I know." The wound that had defined their lives had finally healed, not through Time, but through truth. Their story, once hidden, became a beacon for countless women who had suffered in silence. Letters flooded in from around the world, women thanking her for her courage, for surviving, for speaking, for existing. As she grew older, Claudia began to appear less in films and more in causes. She lent her name to campaigns for women's education, domestic abuse prevention, and gender equality. She stood before parliaments, festivals, and press conferences elegant, unshaken, her words slow but sharp. Each speech was a masterclass in dignity. "The world taught me to be silent," she said once, "so I learned to make silence my language." That sentence would become one of her most quoted lines, inscribed in film retrospectives and social movements alike. When the retrospectives began, Venice, Cannes, Rome, the applause was thunderous, but her acceptance speeches were always simple. "I do not belong to the past," she said at one. "I belong to every woman who ever had to start again." And in that line, she transcended cinema. She was no longer just Claudia Cardinale, the actress. She was Claudia Cardinale, the echo of every woman who had been silenced and had found a way to sing anyway. Yet, even as her life came full circle, there was an unspoken melancholy that clung to her, the kind that comes not from regret, but from knowing how much one life can hold. Friends who visited her in her Paris apartment described her as serene, her laughter still soft, her home filled with light. But on her desk, there were always old photographs, her at 17 in Tunis, her at 30 in Rome, her with Patrick as a baby, as if she still conversed with all the versions of herself she had been forced to bury and resurrect. In her final interviews, she often spoke of destiny, not as fate, but as design, something that could be shaped by endurance. "I was not chosen by cinema," she said. "I chose it, because it was the only place where my silence could be heard." To the very end, she understood the poetry of her own paradox. The woman who spoke little, yet said everything, who suffered deeply, yet made the world believe in beauty, who hid for survival, yet lived for truth. When she eventually withdrew completely from public life, there was no farewell announcement, no dramatic goodbye. She simply disappeared into the folds of Time, leaving behind not a void, but a resonance, the kind that lingers when a song ends, and silence feels sacred. For those who loved her films, Claudia Cardinale remains not just a memory, but a feeling, the quiet ache of something pure that the world almost destroyed, but could never extinguish. Her legacy today is twofold. In cinema, she is remembered as one of the greatest actresses of the 20th century, a bridge between neorealism and modernity, between myth and truth. In life, she is remembered as a woman who dared to exist on her own terms, in a world that tried to define her every move. The ripple of her defiance still touches the generations of actresses who came after her. Women who now speak loudly, fight openly, and thank Claudia for showing that silence, too, can be power. And yet, perhaps her greatest legacy lies in the unanswered question she leaves behind. What is the cost of grace? How much pain hides behind poise? How much strength behind gentleness? Claudia never told us. She let the mystery remain not out of fear, but as art. Because in the end, mystery is not what we don't know about her. It's what she taught us to see in ourselves. Her story is not merely that of a beautiful woman who suffered and survived. It is the story of a human being who turned her scars into symbols, her silence into melody, and her truth into art. Time, which erases everything, has not erased her. It has only revealed her layer by layer, shadow by shadow, until what remains is not the legend of Claudia Cardinale, but the woman herself. The woman who never ran from her past. The woman who turned pain into poetry. The woman who, when the world demanded she be quiet, chose instead to speak in the language of endurance, of love, and of light. And in that final, eternal silence, she said everything.